So I'm getting ready to put the, let's see, what is this? This will be the left side fabric on. I've already done the bottom and I've already done the right side. And what I've decided to do, since I've got access here, using my templates, which I have pictures of, I mark the hole locations and then I punch the holes into the fabric for the cables to pass through. And I went ahead and I undid the cables at the turnbuckles, fed the cables up through the holes, and then reattached them to the turnbuckles. The turnbuckle is a smaller diameter than trying to fit the switch-on fork through the hole, so that's why I did it that way. And then I went ahead and from the inside I put some fabric cement just to keep the hole from getting bigger and fraying and anything like that that may or may not happen. Just as a precaution, put a little bit of cement around it to keep it from growing. I've got my cables for this side in place. I've got this one passed through, this one passed through, and I've got them oriented correctly, meaning that this elevator cable has to pass underneath of the rudder cable. And again, this is the bottom of the fuselage here. So this cable passes underneath this cable. And I had made a little note to myself on a piece of tape, and I put the tape around the cable itself, and it said on it to make sure this goes underneath the rudder cable. So I've got the cable in, I've got it oriented correctly. I've got it on the inside here of my trim tab. It can't be on this side, it's got to be over on this side. So everything is oriented and everything is in place. And then on the outside I coiled up my cables after they pass through the fuselage, just to keep them from dragging on the floor. And it puts a little bit of tension on them too, to kind of hold them in place inside of the fuselage as well. So my plan now is to rough cut, if you will, the fabric for this side. These cables for this side of the fuselage here. These cables, I'll just dump them inside momentarily, put on my piece of fabric, roughly cut it around the perimeter, and then I'll bring the cables. I guess they don't have to come back out, but what I plan on doing is gluing from this end, from the back end, and work my way up. And you can see where these holes are. These are the forwardmost hole positions. So the holes for this side are going to be in roughly that same general area, somewhere in here. So I'm going to fabric from the tail up to about this part with the glue, and I may even go as far as to shrink it ever so slightly to put just a little bit of tension on it. Then I'll bring in my templates, punch those holes, feed the cables through, and then I'll go ahead and unroll the rest of the fabric and glue it in place. So that's the plan. I'm going to glue up to a certain point, put the fabric on to a certain point, punch the holes. I can punch them from the outside, but then feed these cables through those holes, and then go ahead and glue the rest of this and lay out the fabric. So we'll see how that works. So now I've got the bottom and both sides of the fuselage covered. I've got the fuselage flipped back so that it's right side up. I've got it on the floor so it's nice and stable. And you can see I've got the cables coming through the fabric, and I've got them coiled up so that they're not dragging on the floor and getting stepped on. So next up, and the final piece, is the turtle deck area, which you see here. What I like to do, if I can, I like to start with a piece of fabric that has a straight factory edge on it. This is what I call a scrap piece. This was a cut-off piece left over from one of the sides. The Superflight material, I think, is 71 or 72 inches wide. So when you cut something that's only 22 24 inches wide, you've got enough left over from that length to do either the other side of the turtle deck. So I do try to use as much fabric as I can, or I should say save as much fabric as I can, use as much as the scrap pieces, if you will, as I can. But usually those, even the scrap pieces, will have one straight edge, factory straight edge on them, which I like to start with. And basically what I'll do is I already know where I'm going to glue to. I'm going to glue to this top longeron here. So I take my straight edge with a little bit of an overlap. You can see that my longeron is here, and I've got about 2 inches of overlap here. And I'll basically just run that 2 inches down, and then I hold it in place with some kind of a weight. And then I'll just come over to the other side, and with my pinking shears, the same thing. Here's the longeron. This is roughly 2 inches of overlap. And I'll just come through here with my pinking shears and maintain that 2 inches and cut it. And then this remaining scrap piece is actually here. I folded it back up a little bit, but this will be used for, it can be used anything from the patches for access rings and access covers and anything small. So there it is. That's where I'm at now. I'm getting ready to do my initial pre-gluing and start putting this turtle deck on, and that will be it for the big fuselage pieces. Of course, after that's finished and everything is glued and shrunk, I have to go back and do all my finished tapes. So I'm looking forward to that. I've been trying to figure out how to make a cover of some sort to go over this pivot for my elevator controls, elevator and aileron control. This is the bottom of the fuselage. And I've been struggling with it, trying to figure out what to do. I could leave it as is and just put a patch around it, but I didn't like that idea, because if I fly through a little bit of rain, I don't want water coming through, or if I land on muddy fields or wet fields, I don't want debris getting kicked up into here. So I wanted to make some kind of a cover, but yet still allow this to move as it needs to do its job. So what I'm going to try to do is I've cut out a circular patch basically with a mark for the center, and if I position that roughly center over the pivot, now this is being held in place right now by my gust lock, which puts it roughly in the middle of the range. It's a little bit aft, but it's roughly middle of the range, fore and aft. So with that locked in place, roughly centered, I can center this over top of it with my dot. And then I went ahead and I traced around the outer perimeter of this big circle onto the fabric. So what I'm going to plan to do is glue around the edge of this fabric, maybe about, I don't know, 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch, maybe 1/2 inch to 1 inch or so into here, all the way around. And then I'll, just like you do any other patch, after the glue is dry, I'll set this in place, and then I'll come back and I'll glue down through it around its perimeter. And I believe it's big enough that with just a minimal amount of heat, I can take out the little bit of folds and excess material. Now I don't want to shrink this tight, because I don't want it tight over this, because over time this will probably wear through the fabric. So I want to have this completely glued around the perimeter, maybe shrink it a little bit just to take some of the bulk out of it, but have it free enough here so that the pivot can move underneath it without really rubbing too severely, and then it will get painted. That's the plan. No clue if it's going to work, but we'll see how it goes. I am now starting to lay out my hole locations to do the lacing on my cockpit combing foam and vinyl covering. What I've basically done was I had the foam in place like you see here, and I just determined how far from the bottom of the foam down I wanted the vinyl to come and have enough space to put the eyelets in the vinyl so that I can do my stitching. So once I determined that, I just went ahead and marked a straight line across, and then I came back and started marking the hole locations for the eyelets in the vinyl and for the holes that need to be put through the plywood. Now you have to keep in mind where the various braces run and where you have gussets and stuff like that, because obviously you're not going to want to drill and lace through those. So this hole represents, or this mark represents the hole that is as far back as I could go until I hit a gusset. So that's my starting point, and then I'm going to have 2 inches of lacing and then 1 inch of a skip with no lacing, and then lacing, skip, lacing, skip. For the cowling, this is a little bit more difficult, but I basically did the same thing where I had the foam actually in place and I marked an edge where the foam ended, and then from that I came out a 1/2 inch, and this is where I don't know that this is going to be the whole line, but this is basically how far out the material, the vinyl, is going to come so that I can stitch it. Now I have to figure out my hole spacing for this and lay those out along the top of the cowling. The only problem that I have currently is working this curve, because I have my hole stitching, the holes for my stitching coming across this way, and I'm going to have some coming down this way. And because of the blocking that's behind here and where the instrument panel is recessed back here, I can't just continue the holes on around. So I think this is going to be my last hole in the straight line, and then somewhere up in here is going to be the last hole for the cowling. And I don't think I'll connect the two. I think this straight run will just stop, and then this one will come down somewhere and stop. I don't think there'll be any stitching across here, because it's either going to be too long of a stitch or it's going to be way out here. This is a reference hole. It's going to end up coming way out here and then back. So I'm working that issue now, but this is the preliminary layout. After laying out the hole locations on the fuselage, I mimicked those same locations on the back side of the vinyl. You can see here I've got the 2 inch, then the 1 inch gap, 2 inch, 1 inch gap, and so on. Now I've only done enough on this particular piece to match just the straight line length on the fuselage. This is only on the sides of the fuselage. These are not the holes that will start to go around the cowling. So and then of course, since this fabric gets wrapped around like this, the holes on this side have to line up with the holes across the vinyl. Now the way that I determined this width, I basically just used a piece of scrap. This was cut pretty long. I put 2 eyelets in it. I drilled the 2 hole locations on the fuselage and just temporarily held this in place with a couple of screws. And then I'd wrap this around the foam onto the back side and then mark the locations for these holes, and then put the eyelets in, and then again test fit this piece around the foam and around the fuselage longeron, and that gave me this width here, which is this width here. So now I've got the holes made, and the next step is to finish drilling the holes on the side of the fuselage, and then start wrapping this onto the fuselage until I get up to where the canopy starts. and then I'm going to have to figure out how to transfer those hole locations onto the fabric, because I can't just continue this pattern, because there's that shift from this last hole to the first hole that goes around the cowling. I don't know why I can't remember that. So let me get this fitted up and then see what happens. My plan now has changed. I'm going to continue to work as I had originally planned, but rather than trying to make this whole big thing one piece of vinyl, I'm going to break it down into 3 pieces. One piece will go across here on both sides first, and then the final third piece will go around this and come down. Now, of course, there'll be a seam in here somewhere on both sides, but I think that will look a heck of a lot better than trying to get it to curve in here, because it's really going to bunch up and knot, and I really didn't care for how that was going to end up looking. So if I put these 2 pieces on first, this side and this side, and have this come down, this can overlap it this way. That way any water that may get on it will run off, rather than putting this piece on first and having the seam coming up this way where water can get in. So that's my plan, to do 3 pieces. Now I've already fit this piece, and this piece is ready to go on. I know it looks horrible, I'm sure a lot of this kind of stuff makes no sense, but once it's in place I think it will look just fine, and I'll of course have pictures of that. So this is ready to go, this piece is ready to go on. I've got my plyo bond. This is a contact cement. What I'm going to do, I'm going to put my plyo bond around where the fabric's going, or where the vinyl's going to go, on this side here and on this side here. I'm going to wrap it in place. Of course, follow the directions on the bottle. They say to put a coat on the surface and a coat on the vinyl and let it dry, and then come back and put a single coat either on the vinyl or on the surface only. And while that is still tacky, you do the assembly. So once I get the plyo bond on where I want it, of course this will be in place, I'm going to stick it in here and then pull it around and stick it on the outside. I'm going to line up all my holes with the holes in the vinyl. Make sure I got a nice lay across here and everything is sealed and tacked into place. And then I'm going to go ahead and do my stitching, which will be nothing more than decorative at that point. The plyo bond is actually going to be the attaching agent, and then the stitching that I'll do will be solely for aesthetics. So that's the current plan. We'll see how that works out, and then I'll come back. Okay, so I sound a little funny because I'm wearing a mask, because this plyo bond stuff is pretty nasty, and with it being cold outside, I can't have the windows open as much as I would like. So here is the vinyl glued in place, and it came out fairly well actually. I think it will look a lot better once I get it stitched. But it's glued. Like I said, I'm using the plyo bond contact cement. I'm trying to do this one-handed here by leaning over, so hopefully it stays in focus. So next is the stitching, which I'm going to do now. I can't see if that's all the way to the end or not. I believe it is. Standing up on my tippy toes, that's why the camera's shaking all over the place. So let me get the stitching here. But it's on there pretty good with the plyo bond contact cement, so I'm happy with it so far.